Hello class. This lesson will be all about effective communications. Since this is visual presentations class, it's an important skill to learn is how to communicate effectively and be able to say what you need to say concisely and get your message across to whatever audience you are presenting to. So, for starters, we're going to learn a little bit more about what you actually know about effective communications. So, for your in, I want you to start by taking some notes. You're going to identify ways people have communicated with one another throughout history using a defining and context thinking map. So in your in, you're going to have a starting circle map that looks like this. You're going to write effective communications, and please brainstorm all the ideas that you have in the space around the circle map here. And then when you're done, you're going to draw a circle around it. And in your frame of reference, you're going to answer, why are effective forms of communications important? So go ahead and pause this video here so that you can brainstorm your ideas of effective communications. And then for your frame of reference, think about the why they are important. And when you're done with that, you can proceed to the next slide. Hopefully you came up with a bunch of ideas. There's tons of ways that you can effectively communicate with others around you. So for today's objectives, you are going to be able to interpret changes in meaning over time in the perception of familiar works of art. And you're going to do that by using teacher instruction, notes, and a timeline that you'll be drawing in your notes. You will also be able to investigate and discuss how social and political environments influence an artist's creation process in making a work of art. And you're going to do that by using teacher instructions and notes. At the end of today, you will have a little bit of homework. I want you to be able to bring in 5 visual representation examples of your culture to class. So these items should be easy to understand and they should be in color. Please take a moment now to pause this video and write this in your planner as a reminder for your homework. Next in your notes, you're going to be documenting effective communications over time. And one of the ways you're going to do that is by making a timeline. So in your notes, in your through, in the header, you're actually going to be using that space for a timeline, and I'll show you what that's going to look like here. So let's just pretend that I had pages 4 and 5 here. Today's date is listed at the top. You have your in, you did your circle map with all your different ideas about how we've communicated with one another throughout time effectively and why they're important in the frame of reference. Over on the right hand side of your notebook, you're going to do the timeline. So in the space, that inch or so that you have at the top, you're going to be drawing a little timeline up here. So I've drawn a line across, and that's what I'm going to use. Now, it's going to have a variety of different times, dates, and locations of points in history that we're going to be talking about. So you're going to document that at the top of your notes. So our first location that we're going to be looking at is in France, 15,000 BCE. Now, for those of you who are familiar with timelines and such, BCE stands for before Common Era. Okay, so I'm going to write that down here for us, before Common Era. Now that means anything that happened before the year 0. Okay, all the time that happens before the year 0, so I'm going to put 0 here on the timeline. Anything that happens before 0, it actually goes up in number. So before 0, it's going to go 1, 2, 3, all the way up. So we're looking at 15,000 BCE. Now, if we took our timeline out and we said that this is today, now is 2017, then 15,000 BCE would essentially be over 17,000 years ago. 17,017 years ago to be exact. So you would add the 15,000 BCE with the current year. So that's the before Common Era. Anything that is in the present or Common Era, you usually don't have to write BCE or CE in the Common Era because that's the era that we're currently in. But that's anything that's after the year zero. So unlike before the year zero, you don't have to write CE after the date. Anything that's before zero, you do have to write BCE so that we know it's before that time frame. Okay, so our first location is going to take us to France. Take a moment now and get that written in your notebook as you see on my screen right here. And we're going to go ahead and mark the year zero with a cross in our calendar that represents the birth of Christ historically. So go ahead and make sure you have France 15,000 BCE, before Common Era, and you have the year zero and the year 2017 in your notes. Next up, we're going to talk about the Cave of Lascaux in France. So, like I put on your timeline in the previous slide, France 15,000 BCE. What's interesting about this cave is in France, there were these 4 boys in the fall of the 1940. They were playing in the caves. They were about 14 years old, about your guys' age, and they were hanging out together with their friends. In the 40s, it wasn't like they could play on their phones or play on video games or even really watch TV that much. So they were out hanging out with each other and playing games, and came across this cave which had all of these paintings in it. Now, they had spent the entire day checking out the caves, seeing all these cool drawings, and they actually went back home, told their parents that they had found this cave with all of these drawings in it. Well, little did they know that they were the first humans to have laid eyes on these drawings since prehistoric man. They went, and when they told their parents about the cave and they showed their parents actually didn't believe them for the longest time that they had found these drawings. They believed that the boys had drawn them themselves and they had been playing all day, and they didn't believe them. But they were adamant and they said, no, we found these here. And so eventually they believed them, and they brought out some experts to carbon date all of the cave drawings, and they actually found them to be prehistoric drawings. Now, these drawings were very interesting in that they tell a story from left to right. So in your notes, if you go back into your notebook here, you have your timeline at the top. We're going to draw a little number 1 here, and then we're going to put France, and you're going to write that the cave drawings were drawn left to right. Okay? Cave drawings go left to right. Okay. Sorry, my pen is not the greatest. Okay. So left to right. Now, why do we care? Why is that interesting? Well, one of the reasons why we care is this is our first known example of visual storytelling. So this is visual presentations at its basic level. Obviously, these humans were at the stage in their lives where they felt confident in their hunting capabilities, and they were confident in their survival capabilities to the point where art started to develop. And they drew basically a story of their lives at the time. It tells a story, if you follow through all the cave, of a hunt. So it's, you know, them stalking the prey and capturing the prey all the way to the end, and them actually discovering the prey and killing the prey for food. So it's pretty cool. The next video that I'm going to show you is a tour of the cave, and during this, what ended up happening is after the boys had found it and they actually discovered that these were in fact real cave drawings from prehistoric men, a lot of people came to see the cave. And unfortunately, by the 1960s, the cave started to deteriorate. And, you know, with it came all these visitors, came all the bacteria that we have. People were touching the walls and even just breathing the air, which hadn't been exposed to human bacteria in thousands and thousands of years. It started to deteriorate the drawings on the wall. So they had to close it off to the public and to human contact because they didn't want the rest of the cave to be deteriorated. So what they did was they actually created a visual diagram of what it looks like. So if you go there and you visit it, you can go through replicas of the cave, but you can't actually go to the cave, into the cave any longer. So I'm going to show you this this video here. So you can see all the erosion as you go into the cave, and then you start to come across the drawings. It's pretty cool. There's deer, there's bulls and horses depicted in it. And you can tell that water has eroded the ground where it used to be. So currently these are very high, but at the time they were, I'm sure, ground level and not that high, but all the erosion from thousands of years has dug the cave even deeper. And you come across here even more, and the cave goes down even further. And I'm not sure that the teenagers, the boys that were playing in the cave, actually went this deep into the cave when they first found it. I believe that the folks who came afterwards and brought, you know, lights and stuff like that to actually go into the cave deeper probably found it. We look up. And then you have another horse. And I don't know for sure, but it kind of seems to me like maybe somebody actually got injured in the killing of that bull there. It's kind of what it looks like to me, but I'm not sure about that. So this is our first example of visual storytelling that we have. So make sure you put that in your notes as well. First example of visual storytelling. Okay. All right, so here we go. The visual storytelling is an important process in visual presentations, obviously, but when we're thinking about historical purposes, the reason why this example of the cave drawings is so substantial is it was one of the first examples, but it told a story from left to right. So that's somewhat like a comic strip, like what you guys were creating about your break. So it has some similarities and some similar feels to that as well. Next on our timeline is going to be Egypt, and the time frame for that is going to be, let's write Egypt here. We're only going to have 3 stops before the year 0, so we've got Egypt here, and our timeline is going to be 3000 BCE through 1480 BCE. So over here I'm going to write 3000 through 1480 BCE. Okay. Now, in Egypt, the notes that you want to take for Egyptian murals are going to be that hieroglyphs represented 2 things. They represented not only letters that spelled out words, but also they were symbols that represented ideas. So it wasn't just every time you wanted to spell something out. It was kind of like the emoji of today. So for example, if I wanted to spell out the word love, I could, but I could also just do a heart to represent love as the symbol or the visual representation of that. So that's what you want to jot down in your notebook over here. So we're going to do number 2. You're going to say Egypt. Try to save space. I know I'm writing kind of bigger here, but you want to save as much space as you can in your notes as you're writing, because you're gonna need it probably. And you can also copy down hieroglyphs equals letters and symbols. So this picture here on the left is a representation of the Old Kingdom in Egyptian history. Now, one of the things you might notice with the hieroglyphs is they pretty much go from top to bottom. They go around the images and they're pretty basic. They don't have a lot of detail to them as far as some of the newer kingdom hieroglyphs are concerned. They're flat, they're not etched into the stone, they were painted on, and so that's a difference to the writing. Kind of think of the Old Kingdom hieroglyphs as print, and think of the New Kingdom as cursive. So it's more advanced. It's something they learned as they went along and developed the typography in hieroglyphs. And this picture here on the right for the New Kingdom, this picture I actually took myself personally when I was in Egypt. I went to the temple of the Queen Hatshepsut and took this picture. What I found interesting about this was the temple itself is built in the facade of a mountain, and all of these hieroglyphs are exposed to the elements outside. They're not covered really by much. There's a little bit of an overhead cover, but all the paint and all of the etching and everything is exposed to the sun and to the wind and to the sand. So the rain, whatever the elements are in that area. And even still, thousands of years later, you can still see the detail and the artistry that the hieroglyphs have. So an advantage, and part of the reason why these Egyptian murals are still considered effective forms of communication, is their longevity. They have lasted in the test of time, and you can see them even today. So although people don't use this as a form of communication necessarily anymore, they are still available to see, and they've withstood that test of time. I do want to point out a couple of things. So this right here, this symbol, you'll see it on here a couple of times. That's an Ankh. I know it's kind of a funny word, but that means eternal life. Remember, you might see the god Anubis holding on to one of those symbols, and Anubis was one of the gods that would usher the pharaohs from their current lives into the afterlife. And then this symbol right here, kind of drawing around it here, that is a cartouche. And a cartouche typically was used to represent the name of someone important. So if it was a pharaoh or the queen or a god, they might put that symbol on there to show that, hey, this is an important name. Kind of similar to how we capitalize the first letter in a proper noun. That was their way of showing that it was a proper noun or someone important that we should know about. Our next stop on the timeline is actually going to be 500 BCE. This is our last location before we get to the year 0. 500 BCE, and we have 2 locations that go with this one. So the first one is Rome, and the other one is Greece. Okay, so Rome and Greece, 500 BCE. Basically, what ended up happening is the Greeks started to pioneer this idea of public speaking. They were using it very, very often, and everyone started having public discourse and conversations publicly. And so they got really good at having debates and conversations for all to hear in the Greek area. So if you look at the map here, you'll notice that Greece and Italy are neighbors to one another. They're close by. Rome, this is the Roman Empire actually extended much further than just Italy, but they were neighbors. It was very easy for them to travel from one location to the other. I mean, not as easy as it is today. You probably would just take an airplane or something like that. But as far as travel was concerned, they had trade and shared some information across the 2 areas here. But one of the things that ended up happening in that sharing of information, they also shared this idea of public speaking with the Romans. So the Romans really did perfect this idea of public speaking. And you'll want to jot this down in your notes as well, ars oratoria. So ars oratoria means the art of public speaking. Okay? They turned it into an art form. And one of the, I just want to point out, if you weren't sure, I misspelled it. If you weren't sure what oratoria meant, you can kind of break down that word a little bit and, think about toothbrushes that are made by Oral-B. It's coming from the mouth. It goes in your mouth if you're brushing your teeth. So oratoria, public speaking, that's where that comes from. But there are actually 2 professions today that still exist, even in our society now, that are founded from this region of public speaking. Now, normally if I was with you, I might have a few people guess what that is, but since you're doing this independently, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you what those are. The first one is a lawyer. And the second one, I guess, more industry is politicians. We see at this time people becoming politicians and lawyers and defending people in courts and whatnot in this time frame, in this civilization, and they really perfected it, and it continues to be a job even today. Our next stop on the timeline is going to be 950 CE. So since it's the Common Era, I'm not going to write CE. 950, and we're actually going to be in England here. Okay, so in 950 CE, the Roman Empire had grown substantially. And at that stage, it was actually pretty widespread that the Roman Empire, well, when we were back over here, it had grown tremendously. And when in the year 300s, we actually had Constantinople on his deathbed accept or allow Christianity to be spread in the area. And so you saw this tremendous influx of Christian churches, in particularly Roman Catholic churches, being built. And one of those churches is the Canterbury Cathedral. By 950 CE, this idea of churches spreading their message to the people was seen, and it was very popular. But there was a problem. A lot of the people at that time didn't have money to be educated. So education cost a lot of money, and books cost a lot of money too. There wasn't a printing press. They didn't have tons of copies of things. The Bible, if there was a Bible, it had to be hand copied word for word, or any book at that matter had to be copied word for word. So they were few and far between, and not the whole general public, unless they had money, wasn't educated to read those books. So it was kind of a challenge that the church came across. So they decided they needed a way to communicate with other people what the message was of their faith. So to do that, they commissioned artists to create these huge stained glass drawings, basically, that depicted the story of the Bible. So in your notes, you want to put that the Poor Man's Bible told stories, told important stories to the people who couldn't read. This is an example here on the left, the stained glass at the Canterbury Cathedral, and I'll show you a close-up of it here as well. So not only stained glass, but also drawings, statues, all kinds of art was created and commissioned by the church. So, like I said, unless you had money or unless you were a member of the clergy within the church, chances are you probably didn't know how to read. So they made it possible for the average patrons of the church to sit down, look at the artwork around the building, and listen to, the message of the church through those visual representations. Okay, so next we're going to go back to France in 1350 CE. So don't forget to add this date to your timeline at the top. I'm not going to write it for us anymore. You're just going to have to keep up with that on your own. So put that 1350 France. And what we learned about that is there was actually somebody who had been educated in the church. Bishop Nicole Oresme was his name, but you don't need to write that down. But he was a mathematician. He was just a really smart guy. He was one of the first people to come up with the idea of a bar graph. And so this bar graph gave us the capability of plotting variables in a coordinate system. And this is used all the time in presentations, even today. It's something that you learn it in math class, but you probably have seen it before you learned it in math class, comparing different categories of information with other series of information, and that was first done in 1350 CE. This location and time frame is one of my favorites. I'm a big comic book fan, so I really like comics and find it interesting. But 1845, so we're going to visit Switzerland on the timeline in the 1845 or the year of 1845. And we have this guy named Rodolphe Töpffer, and his name's kind of funny, but he was the comic's first inventor. Now, I did mention that the prehistoric cave drawings was one of the first examples we had of visual storytelling from left to right, and we saw, the whole idea of a story coming to fruition. But Rodolphe Töpffer really took it to the next level. He did have access now to a printing press. So unlike the poor man's Bible, where there wasn't really access to the printing press, by this point in time we do have it. And Rodolphe Töpffer, though, was a little bit of a scandalous guy. He was, I would say, the town's gossip, for lack of a better word. He would go and, observe people's interactions, and he would have conversations, and he would go home, and he was actually an artist, and he would just start drawing those interactions and those conversations that he'd had with people or that he knew about with people. And unbeknownst to the town, he was drawing these and actually would print them out, and he'd share them with a bunch of people and pass them out around town. He actually collected all of his drawings into a book later on. But so people were not always very happy with him because he was spreading around all the rumors and gossip about their lives to the rest of the town. But one interesting fact is Rodolphe Töpffer was the first person to not only draw the comics and the scenes as he wanted to depict them, but he was the first person to actually draw a thin black line to separate one scene from the next. So just like you guys were drawing your comics about Break, and you had the little template with the lines separating one scene from the next, this is the guy who actually came up with it. Now, I can't really understand or know what's going on in this particular scene, but it does look pretty funny. I'm not sure what's going on, but you could probably get the gist as to why people were not very happy with him sharing all of his drawings about their lives with the rest of the town. So, but it's an important visual depiction, having that thin black line to separate one spot from the next, or one scene from the next scene. So that's what you want to jot down in your notes, is he drew a thin black line to separate scenes in a comic. Next, we're moving to a more relatively modern time frame. So 1945, the invention of the overhead projector was developed. And this is in the United States. So on your timeline, we're going to put USA 1945. The overhead projector was used primarily by one industry. And you probably can't guess what it is, but I'm going to give you a hint. It's not teachers. It's not businesses. Okay? So the very, very first overhead projector was primarily used by the police. That's what you want to write in your notes, is it was first used by the police. Then they would use it for identification work, matching up fingerprints and whatnot. That was when they first were starting to realize that people had individual fingerprints that were unique to each person and they couldn't be seen on anyone else. And so they would use that. But then quickly thereafter, people who wanted to display both images and text on a screen for a group of people to see started using these. So teachers, businesses became more popular then. Still in the United States, our next stop is going to be in 1950. In 1950, we had the growing popularity and invention of the 35 millimeter slide presentations. Now, back in the day, before photographs were taken digitally, people would take pictures with film. And the 35 millimeter, the reason why it's called that, is the distance between one corner of the film to the next here is 35 millimeters across here. Okay, so we saw that people would take pictures of their different activities that they had and develop them. When you would send your film to get developed, you might take it to a Photoshop store, or not Photoshop, but like a Walgreens, or there was different stores that would develop film, grocery stores, stuff like that. And you could have the option of getting the film slides mounted onto these little white frames. And these white frames would then be placed into a projector like this. And so you can see there's a carousel at the top up here filled with all of those white slides. Okay, and so you'd fill them all up in here, and right about here there's a little slot. And what happens is there's a light bulb at the back of the projector. The light shines through forward like this. Okay, I should use a lighter color so you can actually see that. It shines through here, and it'll go through the lens. But in that slot right there, the slide would drop down and have the light shine through it, and then it would, shine on the wall or wherever it is, the screen that you put up there. And then there's usually a little button or clicker that you would press to move it to the next slot. So that carousel would move around and around as you clicked, and each one of those photos would be shown on the wall. Now, in the 50s, it was really common for folks to have their friends over and invite them over for dinner and show them a little presentation about their vacation that they just took, or have people over. And it kind of got to be a little annoying because people wouldn't want to go over and have to sit through their vacation pictures. But what I find interesting is now today, with the advancement of social media and things like Facebook and Instagram, we want to look at pictures all the time of people's activities. So it's definitely a culture shift that we have seen in modern history of how we use technology to share images with one another. Now we're still in the United States, but specifically on our timeline, we're going to be in California in 1987. During this time, we had the huge, now they're huge, names of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates competing for the #1 computer. And one of the things that came out was this little program called PowerPoint. It gave people the capability of creating presentations and slideshows, and little thought was given to the quality of them. One of the things, unfortunately, at this time, 1987, was not a lot of people had computers. They were very expensive to own, and they were not the most popular thing. You were probably considered a little bit more techie or geeky at the time if you liked computers, and so most people did not own one, or most companies didn't even own one really at this time. But it was a program that was initially developed. You see it here on the Mac platform. It was not in color, it was black and white at the time, but pretty soon you'll see that technology started to develop even further, and PowerPoint became more and more popular as time went on. Next on our timeline is 1992. We finally get the advancement of technology to the point of having a desktop PC. Now, this may look very rudimentary, but this was one of the first computers that companies started to purchase for their employees. At this point, now companies are starting to see that, hey, maybe it's a good idea to get a desktop PC for every single employee if they worked in an office. And prior to this, if they had a computer, they might have one single computer for the entire floor of that office, and it wouldn't be a very popular thing that everyone used. But the cost of these computers started going down. You know, prior to this, they would cost anywhere between $8,000 to like $10,000 depending on the specifications you got, and that was in the 80s. So if you can imagine, you know, that would be like trying to buy a computer for over $15,000 today, approximately. So however, the cost to make them started going down, and more people, they got more and more popular, so more people started buying them. One of the things that you would do to use this computer is you would have to use what was called floppy disks, and I'm going to show you a picture of one here. If you'd ever like to see an actual floppy disk, I do have some. You can ask me in another time to show them to you, and these guys right here are different formats of floppy disks. They started out pretty big, okay, and then as time progressed, they got smaller and smaller. They really were floppy, so if you flopped them around, they wiggled and stuff. And but it was a place for you to save data. You would also have to use a floppy disk. You'd put a floppy disk in to actually run a program. So the capacity of memory on these computers was so small that they couldn't even hold a single program on them. And today you look at our computers and they have tons of programs on them, tons of apps. And but the application would be saved on a floppy disk. You'd have to stick it in one of the drives, and then if you typed up a letter or you did anything, a presentation, you'd have to put in another floppy disk to save your work. So that was the process that people would have to go through to use these computers. They weren't the most they weren't the most developed technology compared to today, but it was definitely a step in advancement. Today, now, we have devices such as scan disks like this, mini itty bitty ones that even go in your phones and in your cameras. And the capability of one of these floppy disks here of memory might be like 128 megabytes. Okay, so pretty small capability. And then when you look at comparatively the capability we have today, where we can save like 16 gigabytes on a scan disk, or we even have hard drives that have terabytes of memory. So it's pretty impressive at how much we can actually save in such a small space. And since the advancement of this desktop technology, one of the things that ended up happening was the 35 millimeter presentations really started to become obsolete and go extinct, like my little dinosaur shows here. So we no longer had people using the slide projectors nearly as much. And in fact, the company Kodak, which they're a film company, they actually stopped producing the chemicals that you need to develop slide projector, the little slides anymore. So they don't make that formula, that chemical any longer. So if you wanted to have slides made, it would be next to impossible to actually do that even today. Everything has been converted to the digital format, and the PC was really one of the first ways that started. And I want you guys to think, why, other than convenience, obviously, but why is it, do you think, that our technology started to shrink? Because even this desktop PC is fairly small compared to computers that existed. I mean, we've had computers since, even through the 50s and 60s, but those computers were the size of an entire room, okay? They were huge. And one of the things that, we have seen over time is that they've actually shrunk. So think about that for a moment. Why do you think that is? Okay, well, hopefully you have a good guess in your head, but it has everything to do with the space race. okay, and getting the first man on the moon. So part of the reason why technology started to develop and shrink over time is because of the space race and because of our desire for learning more about the universe and space in general. It's very expensive to send someone up to space, and you do need some technology to be able to make that happen. And so, in order to have the capability of sending someone up into space, like the International Space Station even today, we have to be able to send up tools and items that are lighter in capacity. So part of the reason why we have seen the advancement and the shrinkage of our computers and computer chips and microprocessors and all of that is because of the desire to send men and women up into space. One of the things that happened starting in the year, well, prior to year 2003, we actually saw PowerPoint come across in 1987 and technology get more and more popular, as I said. But part of the things that happens was PowerPoint became used and overused, I would say, and to the point where we have PowerPoint overload. No longer are people using PowerPoint in necessarily an effective way. It's just sort of white noise because everyone is using it over and over and over again. And the statistics are pretty fascinating. So early in the 21st century, several 100 million copies of Microsoft PowerPoint were turning out trillions of slides each year. So, slideware often reduces the analytical quality of presentations. The example I like to use here is a toy maker. Let's say, for example, that I was a toy maker and I made a really quality, handcrafted, hand-painted airplane. And I hired this entire classroom of people to be my workers and to help me create these airplanes. Every person can only make so many airplanes per day because there's so much craftsmanship and quality that goes into each one. Well, these toys, these airplanes, become the must-have toy of the season. It's a hit. Everyone wants one. So I start to sell this product like crazy. And with my product being sold, I'm able to get some profits in. So I reinvest that money back into my company to actually make or to get some technology to help me make my toys faster. I need to make more because more people want to buy them, and our capability and production speed is not as fast as what the clients are asking for. So I purchase a machine that helps me, let's say, cut out the wood pieces for all the airplanes. But in the meantime, that means I have to fire about a third of my employees because I don't need them anymore. And my machine that I purchased actually does the trick. It does the job, and I still need about 2/3 of my workforce though, because that 2/3 has to put the wood pieces together, has to paint them, package them, etc. Well, I continue to sell and I continue to make more profits. I continue to reinvest in my company. So I'm going to go ahead and get a whole nother machine that's going to advance my production even further. And that production now reduces my workforce by another third. And so now I only have about a third of my original staff working. And that machine actually puts the wood pieces together for me. But I still need my hand painters. They're going to be the ones that paint them, package them, send them off. Well, my popularity continues to grow, and then I'm going to have the last third of my staff let go, and I'm only going to need one employee, one person left in the group to be my staff person who helps turn the computers and the machines on, fixes them if there's some sort of a mistake that happens. but everyone else has been laid off because my machines do all of my work for me. Now, the one thing that happens though is even though I have an increase in the number of toys that I'm making, I have a decrease in quality because there's not as much observation and human human oversight for every single one of those toys. So my quality starts to diminish. And the same thing is true for PowerPoint. We saw trillions and trillions of these slides being made in everyday life, but the quality started to diminish. So in 2007, a documentary came out called An Inconvenient Truth. And this movie was actually made by Al Gore. So if you're not familiar with who Al Gore was, he was actually running to be president, and he lost to President George W. Bush. And so instead of just not doing anything, he decided he was really passionate about global warning, a global warning about climate change. So he went around the country to a variety of colleges and any place he could get to go and speak about his topic. And he had little more than a PowerPoint that he went around with. It had really great graphics, but in general, it was a PowerPoint that he went and told people about climate change and the scientific impacts of global warming. Now, there are still a lot of scientists who debate whether or not what he said was true, so there's some controversy surrounding his presentation in itself. However, that year, he actually ended up winning a Nobel Peace Prize and an Academy Award for his documentary on climate change. He was so passionate about what he wanted to communicate that he got out there and he shared his message. And that's what I want you to take away from this particular segment, is that you can have an important message that you want to share, and you can do it with just a little bit more, him going out and traveling, but he basically did it with a PowerPoint. So we're at the conclusion pretty much of our notes for today. But I want to ask you the question, where do you fit in all of this? Okay? So if we think about why do we care about Egyptian murals, and why do we care about overhead projectors and computers being made and microchips shrinking, where do you fit into all of this? Okay? So my answer and my challenge to you is, today, now more than ever, visual presentations is a requirement, not only in school, but also in the workforce. When you go out and you get a job, people are asking their employees to think visually now more than ever, and to communicate visually. With the advancements, again, of social media, VR, virtual reality technology, and our mobile devices, we are just embedded with tons and tons of visualizations. So it's now more than ever imperative that not only do you know how to use these types of visualizations, but that you can create them yourselves. So I want to challenge you to think about, in this class, how can you translate information into a visual presentation? And for your out today, I want you to write an example of a message and describe the visual presentation of that same message. So I gave this example earlier in your notes, but I drew a heart to represent love. So I want you to think of a symbol that you can draw and write its explanation next to it. That is your out for today. Don't forget, as homework, you need to bring in 5 visual representation examples of your culture to the next class. These items should be easy to understand, and they should be in color. So think of something that represents your culture and bring in 5 of those representations. Now, you can either print them out from home. If you have a color printer at home and you want to go online and find those pictures and print them out, you just need them to all fit on one page. Okay, all 5 of them should fit on one page. No bigger than one single page for your 5 pictures. I don't recommend you bring in an image like a photograph unless you're okay with not necessarily getting it back, because it is going to be glued onto a larger sheet of paper for the class to see. And if you don't have access to a color printer, maybe you go and cut some out of a magazine. If you don't have access to a magazine, why don't you get a blank sheet of paper, not a lined sheet of paper, but a blank sheet of paper, and get some colored pencils and draw your 5 images. Okay, so there are 3 different options for you to bring those types of pictures in, whatever you have access to. Please bring those in for our next class. Thank you.